Gilgamesh, retold by Herbert Mason. Why are you worried about death? Only the gods are immortal anyway, sighed Gilgamesh. What men do is nothing, so fear is never justified. What happened to your power that once could challenge and equal mine? I will go ahead of you, and if I die, I will at least have the reward of having people say he died in war against Humbaba. You cannot discourage me with fears and hesitations. I will fight Humbaba. I will cut down his centers. Tell the armorers to build us two-edged swords and double shields, and tell them I am impatient and cannot wait long. Thus Gilgamesh and Enkidu went together to the marketplace to notify the elders of Uruk, who were meeting in their senate. They too were talking of Humbaba, as they often did, edging always in their thoughts towards the forbidden. The one you speak of, Gilgamesh addressed them, I now must meet. I want to prove him not the awesome thing we think he is, and that the boundaries set up by gods are not unbreakable. I will defeat him in his cedar forest. The youth of Uruk need this fight. They have grown soft and restless. The old man leaned a little forward, remembering old wars. A flush burned on their cheeks. It seemed a little dangerous, and yet they saw their king, who seized with passion for this fight. Their voices gave the confidence his friend had failed to give. Some even said Enkidu's wisdom was a sign of cowardice. You see, my friend, laughed Gilgamesh, the wise of Uruk have outnumbered you. Amidst the speeches in the hall that called upon the gods for their protection, Gilgamesh saw in his friend that pain he had seen before and asked him what it was that troubled him. Enkidu could not speak. He held his ears back. Barely audibly he said, It is a road which you have never traveled. The armorers brought to Gilgamesh his weapons and put them in his hand. He took his quiver, bow and axe, and two-edged sword, and they began to march. The elders gave their austere blessing, and the people shouted, Let Enkidu lead. Don't trust your strength. He knows the forests. The one who goes ahead will save his friend. May Shamash bring you victory. After 3 days, they reached the edge of the forest where Humbaba's watchman stood. Suddenly, it was Gilgamesh who was afraid. Enkidu, who reminded him to be fearless. The watchman sounded his warning to Humbaba. The two friends moved slowly toward the forest gate. When Enkidu touched the gate, his hand felt numb. He could not move his fingers or his wrist. His face turned pale like someone's witnessing a death. He tried to ask his friend for help, whom he had just encouraged to move on, but he could only stutter and hold out his paralyzed hand. It will pass, said Gilgamesh. Would you want to stay behind because of that? We must go down into the forest together. Forget your fear of death. I will go before you and protect you. Enkidu followed close behind, so filled with fear he could not think or speak. Soon they reached the high cedars. They stood in awe at the foot of the green mountain. Pleasure seemed to grow from fear of Gilgamesh, as when one comes upon a path in woods and visited by men, one is drawn near the lost and undiscovered in himself. He was revitalized by danger. They knew it was the path Humbaba made. Some called the forest hell and others paradise. What difference does it make, said Gilgamesh. But night was falling quickly, and they had no time to call it names, except perhaps the dark. Before they found a place at the edge of the forest to serve as shelter for their sleep. It was a restless night for both. One snatched at sleep and sprang away from dreams. The other could not rest because of pain that spread throughout his side. Enkidu was alone, with sights he saw brought on by pain and fear as one in deep despair. May lie beside his love who sleeps and seems so unafraid. absorbing in himself the phantoms that she cannot see. Phantoms diminished for one when two can see and stay awake to talk of them, and search out a solution to despair, or lie together in each other's arms, or weep and in exhaustion from their tears, perhaps find laughter for their fears. But alone and awake, the size and nature of the creatures in his mind grow monstrous, beyond resemblance to the creatures he had known before the prostitute had come into his life. He cried aloud for them to stop appearing over him, emerging from behind the trees with phosphorescent eyes, brought on by rain. He could not hear his voice, but knew he screamed and could not move his arms. But though they tried to move, as if a heavy weight he could raise or wiggle out from under him had settled on his chest, like a turtle trapped beneath a fallen branch. Each effort only added to paralysis. He could not make his friend, his one companion, hear. Gilgamesh awoke, but could not hear. His friend in agony, he still was captive to his dreams, which he would tell aloud to exorcise. I saw us standing in a mountain gorge. A rock slide fell on us. We seemed no more than insects under it. And then a solitary, graceful man appeared and pulled me out from under the mountain. He gave me water, and I felt released. Tomorrow you will be victorious, Enkidu said, to whom the dream brought chills, for only one of them he knew would be released, which Gilgamesh could not perceive in the darkness, for he went back to sleep without responding to his friend's interpretation of his dream. Did you call me? Gilgamesh sat up again. Why did I wake again? I thought you touched me. Why am I afraid? I felt my limbs grow numb, as if some god passed over us, drawing out our life. I had another dream. This time the heavens were alive with fire, but soon the clouds began to thicken. Death rained down on us. The lightning flashes stopped, and everything which rained down turned to ashes. What does this mean, Enkidu? That you will be victorious against Humbaba. Enkidu said, or someone said through him, because he could not hear his voice, or move his limbs, although he thought he spoke. And soon he saw his friend asleep beside him. At dawn, Gilgamesh raised his axe and struck at the great cedar. When Humbaba heard the sound of falling trees, he hurried down the path that they had seen, but only he had traveled. Gilgamesh felt weak at the sound of Humbaba's footsteps and called to Shamash, saying, I have followed you in the way decreed. Why am I abandoned now? Suddenly the winds sprang up. They saw the great head of Humbaba, like a water buffalo's bellowing down the path. His huge and clumsy legs, his flailing arms, thrashing at phantoms in his precious trees. His single stroke could cut the cedar down and leave no mark on him. His shoulders, like a porter's under building stones, were permanently bent by what he bore. He was the slave who did the work for gods, but whom the gods would never notice. Monstrous in his contortion, he aroused the two almost to pity. But pity was the thing that might have killed him, made them pause just long enough to show how pitiless he was to them. Gilgamesh, in horror, saw him strike the bad Enkidu and beat him to the ground until he thought his friend was crushed to death. He stood still, watching as the monsters leaned to make his final strike against his friend, unable to move to help him. And then Enkidu slid along the ground like a ram making its final launch, on wounded knees. Humbaba fell and seemed to crack the ground itself in two, and Gilgamesh, as if this fall had snapped him from his daze, returned to life and stood over Humbaba with his axe, raised high above his head, watching the monster plead in strangled sobs and desperate appeals, the way the sea contorts under a violent squall. I'll serve you as I serve the gods, Humbaba said. I'll build you houses from their sacred trees. Enkidu feared his friend was weakening and called out, Gilgamesh, don't trust him! As if there were some hunger in himself that Gilgamesh was feeling. that turned him momentarily to yearn for someone who would serve. He paused, and then he raised his axe up higher and swung it in a perfect arc into Humbaba's neck. He reached out to touch the wounded shoulder of his friend, and late that night he reached again to see if he was yet asleep, but there was only quiet breathing. The stars against the midnight sky were sparkling like mica in a riverbed. In the slight breeze, the head of Humbaba was swinging from a tree.